This week, I'll be discussing personality from Chapter 11. I'll be talking about it through the different psychological perspectives and then take a brief look at personality measures and assessments. When looking at personality, the general psychological definition is considered to be a pattern of enduring characteristics of thoughts, feelings, and actions that make a person unique. Personality comes from within the individual and is pretty consistent throughout one's life. There is a consistency and regularity to a person's behavior, so people tend to express certain aspects of their personality in different situations, and the responses are generally stable. In other words, people act in the same ways or similar ways in a variety of situations. There are a multitude of ways we express who we are. For example, does Dennis Rodman's appearance say anything about his personality? Let's take a look now at the different psychological perspectives and see how personality is explained through each approach. I'll also include a major personality theory called trait theory. Each of these perspectives on personality attempts to describe different patterns in personality, including how these patterns form and how people differ on an individual level. Let's look first at the neuroscience or biological approach to personality. The biological approach suggests that important components of personality are inherited. That would include our cognitive abilities, so say for example like Einstein, our temperament, our sexual orientation, and psychological disorders. This approach explains how these and other components of personality are determined to some extent by genetic factors. For example, there has been research supporting hypothalamus, endocrine, and X-linked differences in sexual orientation. Research has also shown that personality is influenced by biological processes and needs. For example, while your personality might lead you to be shy in social situations, an emergency situation might make you take on a more take charge approach. Remember when we talked about learning? This means we're talking about the behavioral approach. A behaviorist would say that personality is a collection of learned behavior patterns and that both normal and abnormal behaviors are responses to various stimuli. This theory suggests that personality is a result of the interaction between the individual and the environment. Behavioral theorists only study what is observable and measurable behaviors and reject any theories that would look at internal thoughts or feelings. Remember Watson and Skinner? They believed that environment determined behavior, so that according to them, people behave in consistent patterns because they have certain response tendencies, which means over time, people learn to behave in particular ways. They actually didn't believe that childhood played a determinant role in shaping personality. Instead, they thought that personality develops over the whole lifespan and that people's responses change as they encounter new experiences. For example, say that when you were younger, you lived in the suburbs. You developed a liking for fast driving because your friends enjoyed riding with you, and you never got speeding tickets. After college, you moved to the city, and whenever you drove fast, you got a speeding ticket. Also, your new friends were much more cautious about driving in fast cars, so now you don't like to drive fast and consider yourself to be a conscious person. The humanistic approach emphasizes the responsibility people have for their own behavior, and it concentrates on what is uniquely human. This approach views people as basically rational, oriented toward a social world, and motivated to seek self-actualization. One of the humanistic theorists was Carl Rogers, and he believed in the inherent goodness of people and emphasized the importance of free will and psychological growth. He suggested that the actualizing tendency is the driving force behind human behavior. He believed that one's self-concept is the most important feature of personality, and it includes all the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs people have about themselves. He said that people's self-concepts often do not match reality. For example, you may consider yourself to be a very honest person, but you often lie to your boss about why you are late to work. Rogers used the term incongruence to refer to the discrepancy between our self-concept and reality. Congruence, on the other hand, is a fairly accurate match between our self-concept and reality. He thought that people experience anxiety when their self-concepts are threatened, so to protect themselves from anxiety, people distort their experiences so that they can hold on to their self-concept. For example, you believe you are a very generous person, although you are often stingy with your money and usually leave small tips or no tip at all. When a dining companion comments on your tipping behavior, you insist that the tips you leave are proportional to the service you get. By attributing your tipping behavior to bad service, you can avoid anxiety and maintain your self-concept of being generous. Related to learning is the cognitive perspective of personality, also known as the social cognitive perspective, which emphasizes the importance of cognitive processes, observational learning, self efficacy, and situational influences. One of the major theorists of this perspective is Albert Bandura, and his research focused on the importance of social learning or learning through observation. His theory emphasized the role of conscious thoughts of our own beliefs and our abilities. This theory explains how people acquire and maintain certain behavioral patterns. There are three factors at play here: the environment, people, and behavior. What surrounds us shapes who we are, which in turn affects our actions. And these three factors are constantly influencing each other. So the environment refers to the factors that can affect a person's behavior, which include social and physical environments. Social environments might include family members, friends, and colleagues. Physical environment might be the size of a room, the temperature, whether it's hot or cold, or the availability of certain foods. The environment can help us understand ours and others' behavior. For example, we might tell a dirty joke around some people and not others, get really irritated when it's hot and humid outside, or lose our cool when we're driving. Situation also plays a role. The situation refers to the cognitive or mental representations of the environment that may affect a person's behavior, and this includes a person's perception of the place, time, and physical features of the environment. Remember perception from way, way back? This is just another example of the ways that perception can affect our cognitive processes. Behavior is not simply the result of the environment and the person, just as the environment is not simply the result of the person and behavior. It is an ongoing relationship between all three. According to the psychodynamic approach of personality proposed by Sigmund Freud, who advanced the first formal theory of personality, he says we are guided by inner forces and conflicts about which we have little awareness and over which we have little or no control. He stressed the importance of early childhood events, the influence of the unconscious, and sexual instincts in the development and formation of personality. So, according to Freud, personality develops out of each person's struggle to meet his or her needs in a world that often frustrates these efforts. He identified two structures of personality: the three levels of consciousness and the three levels of mind. And I'll go over each one of these separately. In the psychodynamic approach, Freud believed that personality and behavior come from an interaction of conflicting psychological forces that occur at three different levels of awareness that tells us how the mind is organized: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. Conscious awareness includes the awareness of one's current environment at any given time. Preconscious awareness is the part of the mind that represents ordinary memory. While we are not consciously aware of this information at any given time, we can retrieve it and bring it into consciousness when we need it. In other words, it is material that is easily brought to mind, such as when you remember your friend's name or where you live. The unconscious is part of the personality that contains memories, beliefs, feelings, urges, drives, and instincts of which one is not aware. Most of the contents of the unconscious are usually unacceptable or unpleasant, such as feelings of pain, anxiety, or conflict, and they influence our behavior and experience even though we are unaware of these underlying feelings. The second structure in the psychodynamic model personality structure is the three levels of the mind: the id, the ego, and the superego. According to Freud, these three elements of personality work together to create complex human behaviors. The id is the raw, unorganized, inborn part of personality that holds primitive drives and is the only component that is present at birth. This aspect of personality is entirely unconscious and includes all of our instinctive and primitive behaviors. Again, according to Freud, the id is the source of all psychic energy, making it the primary component of personality. The id is driven by the pleasure principle, which is the striving for immediate gratification of all desires, wants, and needs. If these needs are not satisfied immediately, the result is a state of anxiety or tension. This is a normal occurrence in everyday life. For example, when you have an increase in hunger or thirst, it should produce an immediate attempt to eat or drink. However, immediately satisfying these needs is not always realistic or even possible. If we were ruled entirely by the pleasure principle, we might find ourselves grabbing things we want out of other people's hands to satisfy our own cravings. You might not make many friends or keep them if you engaged in this behavior. The ego is the component of personality that is responsible for dealing with reality. According to Freud, the ego develops from the id and ensures that the impulses of the id can be expressed in a way that is acceptable in the world. The ego operates based on the reality principle. which strives to satisfy the id's desires in realistic and socially appropriate ways. The reality principle weighs the costs and benefits of an action before deciding to act upon or abandon impulses. In other words, the ego strives to balance the desires of the id and the realities of the objective outside world through higher order thinking so as to maintain the safety of the individual in society. The superego is the aspect of our personality that holds our sense of right and wrong, which we acquire from parents and society. It is our conscience. The superego gives us guidelines for making judgments and ensures we don't step out of bounds. The superego acts to perfect and civilize our behavior. It works to suppress all unacceptable urges of the id and tries to make the ego act upon perfectionistic standards rather than upon realistic principles. The superego is also known as the critic, since it can distort our sense of moral standards and ideals. Think of a perfectionist, for example. If something is not done to a certain standard, a perfectionist may hear an internal voice telling them that they're stupid or worthless. That is the voice of the inner critic. If you get an A rather than an A plus on an exam and you are a perfectionist, that could set off a harsh superego attack on yourself, either through thoughts or actions. Something has to be just right, or it may lead to bad consequences, punishments, or feelings of guilt and remorse. According to Freud, the key to a healthy personality is a balance between these three elements of the mind. To recap the psychodynamic theory of personality, let's take a look at this image, which is called the Freud's iceberg model of personality. Freud often used the metaphor of an iceberg to describe the two major aspects of human personality. The tip of the iceberg that extends above the water represents the conscious mind. As you can see in the image, the conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the water is the much larger bulk of the iceberg, which represents the unconscious. While the conscious and preconscious are considered important, he believed that the unconscious was the most important because the things that are hidden from awareness exerted the greatest influence over our personalities and behaviors. Another aspect of the psychodynamic theory are Freud's stages in developing personality, which are called the psychosexual stages of personality development. The stages include the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency period, and the genital stage. According to this theory, as a person develops, he or she moves through various psychosexual stages. During each stage, different parts of the body become the focus of pleasure and satisfaction, and therefore the conflicts of the three structures of mind, remember id, ego, and superego, focuses on these different parts too. So failure to resolve the conflicts among the structures at each stage leaves the individual fixated. This means that the person is overly attached to or unconsciously preoccupied with the pleasure area of that stage. I'll go through each one briefly. Let's look at the oral stage first, which is birth to 12 months. The center of pleasure is the mouth, and the conflict to resolve is weaning. If weaning doesn't occur in an appropriate manner, this can lead to orally aggressive behavior such as chewing gum or biting the ends of pencils or fingernails, or orally passive behaviors such as talking too much, overeating, smoking, drinking excessively, or gossiping. The second stage, the anal stage, occurs at 1 to 3 years. The center of pleasure are bowel movements, and the conflict to resolve is toilet training. Fixation behaviors include being stingy, stubborn, controlling, sloppy, disorganized, or impulsive. These fixations have two categories, anal retentive and anal expulsive. Someone with a conflict at this stage might be obsessively neat and organized, which would be an example of anal retentiveness, or they may be reckless, careless, defiant, or disorganized, which would be an example of anal expulsiveness. The phallic stage is 3 to 5 or 6 years, and the center of pleasure is the genitals, and the conflict to resolve is the physical desire for the opposite sex parent. Some fixation behaviors include extreme fear, aggression, or difficulties with an authority figure, uncertainty about one's identity as a male or female, problems maintaining a stable love relationship, and disordered or socially disapproved sexual behavior. In the latent stage from 6 years to puberty, sexual impulses lie dormant and the child focuses on education and matters like social skills and achievement. The purpose of this stage is to consolidate the child's same-sex identity. In the genital stage, which is puberty through adulthood, the center of pleasure are the genitals, and the conflict to resolve is the development of one's identity, and the redirection of one's sexual urges towards appropriate attachment figures such as peer love and interests. Critics of this theory say it is focused almost entirely on male development. There are difficulties in predicting future behavior, so how do we know that our current behavior was caused specifically by a childhood experience? is based on case studies and not empirical research, and is based on the recollection of adult patients rather than actual observation and study of children. Let's move now to Freud's defense mechanisms, which are unconscious strategies that people use to reduce anxiety by concealing its source from themselves and others. Some of these defense mechanisms include repression, regression, displacement, sublimation, reaction formation, projection, rationalization, and denial. I'll go through each one of these briefly. Let's start with denial, which is actually not listed on this table, but it is an important one and is probably one of the best known defense mechanisms. It is often used to describe situations in which people seem unable to face reality or admit an obvious truth, so we say that someone is in denial. It is an outright refusal to admit or recognize that something has occurred or is currently occurring. Drug addicts or alcoholics often deny that they have a problem, while hospital patients may deny the cancer diagnosis a doctor just gave them. Repression is a way to keep information out of our conscious awareness. However, these memories don't simply disappear, they continue to influence our behavior. For example, a person who has repressed memories of abuse suffered as a child may have difficulty forming relationships later. Another defense mechanism is regression. This happens when a person who is confronted by stressful events sometimes abandons coping strategies and revert to patterns of behavior used earlier in development. So people act out behaviors from one of the stages of psychosexual development in which they are fixated. For example, an individual fixated at an earlier developmental stage might throw a tantrum upon hearing unpleasant news. The behavior depends on the stage in which the person is fixated. So an individual fixated at the oral stage may binge eating or drinking excessively, which would be different from someone fixated at the anal stage. Another defense mechanism called displacement involves taking out our frustrations, feelings, and impulses on people or objects that are less threatening. Displaced aggression is a common example of this defense mechanism. Rather than express our anger in ways that could lead to negative consequences, like arguing with our boss, for example, we instead express our anger towards a person or object that poses no threat, such as our spouse, our children, or our pets. Sublimation is a defense mechanism that allows us to act out unacceptable impulses by transferring these behaviors into a more acceptable form. For example, a person experiencing extreme anger might take up kickboxing or chop wood as a means of venting frustration. Reaction formation works by reducing anxiety by taking up the opposite feeling, impulse, or behavior. An example of reaction formation would be treating someone you strongly dislike in an excessively friendly manner in order to hide your true feelings. Projection is a defense mechanism that involves taking our own unacceptable qualities or feelings and ascribing them to other people. For example, if you have a strong dislike for someone, you might instead believe that he or she does not like you. In other words, if you spot it, you got it. Rationalization is when you explain an unacceptable behavior or feeling in a rational or logical manner, avoiding the true reasons for the behavior. For example, a person who is turned down for a date might rationalize the situation by saying they were not attracted to the other person anyway. Or a student might blame a poor exam score on the instructor rather than his or her lack of preparation. Okay, let's turn now and look at trait approaches. Trait theory says that personality consists of broad, enduring dispositions that tend to lead to characteristic responses. So if someone asks you to describe the personality of a friend, you might use some descriptive terms such as funny, playful, and outgoing, or serious and reserved. All of these descriptors represent traits. So what is a trait? A trait can be described as a relatively stable characteristic that causes individuals to behave in certain ways, so consistent personality behaviors are displayed in different situations. The trait approach focuses on differences that are unique to each individual, so people can be described in terms of the basic ways they behave. There are two trait approaches I'll be discussing for purposes of this class, the Big Five and the Enneagram. Let's start with the Big Five personality traits. This model of personality represents 5 core traits that interact to form human personality that most researchers agree serve as the basic traits for the building blocks of personality. The first one is openness to experience, which features characteristics such as imagination and insight, and those high in this trait also tend to have a broad range of interest. Next is conscientiousness, where some common features on one end include high levels of thoughtfulness with good impulse control and goal-directed behaviors. Those high in conscientiousness tend to be organized and mindful of details. Extroversion is next. And those high in extroversion include characteristics such as excitability, sociability, talkativeness, assertiveness, and high amounts of emotional expressiveness. Agreeableness is a personality trait that includes attributes such as trust, altruism, kindness, affection, and other prosocial behaviors. For those high in neuroticism, on the other hand, they tend to experience emotional instability, anxiety, moodiness, irritability, and sadness. Keep in mind that each of these 5 personality factors represents a range between 2 extremes. For example, extroversion represents a continuum between extreme extroversion and extreme introversion. Most people lie somewhere in between the 2 ends of the spectrum. Here's a little tip. Remember way back when we were talking about memory? Well, here's a way that can help you remember the Big Five by using the acronym OCEAN. Let's turn now to the Enneagram. The Enneagram of personality describes 9 distinct personality types, all with their own distinct traits or characteristics. Each personality type is defined by a chief mental and emotional concern which underlies the development of the personality and highly influences the life experiences of the person who falls under that particular Enneagram type, also known as Enneatype. Let's take a look now at this image, which is a representation of the Enneagram. Let's start with point 1. Point 1 is the good person, also known as the perfectionist. And they are the ones motivated by the need to live life the right way, improve oneself and others, and to avoid anger. Point 2 is the loving person, also known as the good person or the helper. And these people are motivated by the need to be loved and appreciated and to express positive feelings toward others. Point 3 is known as the effective person or the achiever, and they have the need to be productive, to achieve success, and to avoid failure. Point 4 is the original person, also known as the romantic or the tragic romantic. They have the need to feel special. They search for the meaning of life and try to avoid being seen as ordinary. Point 5 is the wise person or the observer, and they are motivated by the need to know and understand everything, to be self-sufficient, and they like to have the answers, and they don't like to be seen as looking foolish. Point 6 is the loyal person or the questioner. They have a need for security and they can be anxious and suspicious. There are 2 types of Enneagram Type 6s, those that are phobic, and they are anxious about everything and try to hide from their fears. And then there are those that are counterphobic, and those are the ones that confront their fears so they go towards what they're afraid of. People who are devil's advocates usually fall into this category. Point 7 is known as the joyful person, also known as the adventurer. They are motivated by the need to be happy and plan fun things, to contribute to the world, and to avoid suffering and pain. Point 8 is the powerful person, also known as the boss, and they have the need to be self-reliant and strong, to make an impact on the world, and to avoid being seen as weak. You usually know when an Enneatype 8 walks into the room, as they are usually loud and command a lot of attention. Finally, point 9 is the peaceful person, also known as the mediator. They are motivated by the need to keep the peace, merge with others, and to avoid conflict. I'm going to keep these descriptions brief for now, as we will have time to explore this more in class. Let's turn now to looking at assessing personality. What are some of the measures used for discovering personality traits? Personality assessing is something that we informally do every day, especially when we talk about ourselves and when we talk about others. This usually includes all the different characteristics of an individual's personality. Professionals like psychologists do much the same thing when they assess personality, but they do so on a more systematic and scientific level. That's where personality testing comes in. There are techniques that are used to accurately and consistently measure personality. They are typically used to assess different theories, to look at personality changes, to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular therapy, and to help diagnose a psychological disorder. Personality tests are also used in the workplace for screening job candidates too. There are 2 types of personality tests we'll be covering in class: objective tests and projective tests. Objective tests are usually self-report inventories that involve test takers reading questions and then rating how well the questioner's statement applies to them. Some of the major objective tests used in the psychological field are the NEOPI, which is based on the Big Five model. It assesses emotional, interpersonal, experiential, attitudinal, and motivational styles of one's personality. The Myers-Briggs, which is based on Carl Jung's personality types. This test is designed to look at what people perceive and how they reach conclusions in order to understand their interests, reactions, values, motivations, and skills. And the most frequently used, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI-2. This is designed to detect abnormal personalities and psychological difficulties as well as to predict everyday behavior. Now, projective tests are tests that interpret ambiguous stimuli so that unconscious feelings will be projected in the interpretation. A projective test is a type of personality test in which an individual offers responses to ambiguous scenes, words, or images. This type of test emerged from the psychodynamic school of thought, which suggested that people have unconscious thoughts or urges, so these tests were intended to uncover unconscious desires that are hidden from conscious awareness. So, how do these projective tests usually work? A person is shown an ambiguous image and then asked to give the first response that comes to mind. The key to projective tests is the ambiguity of the stimuli. According to the theory behind such tests, clearly defined questions result in answers that are carefully crafted by the conscious mind. By providing the participant with a question or stimulus that is not clear, the underlying unconscious motivations or attitudes are revealed. Some examples of projective tests are the Rorschach, the Thematic Apperception Test, or the TAT, and the Make a Picture Story, or MAPS. We'll have a chance to explore some examples of these and other types of personality assessments in class. Okay, that's it for now.